This is Maggie Coomer.
And this is Jasmin Brand.
And you're tuning in for part 2 of H.H. Holmes. And this is where it gets ugly. So, listener discretion is advised. All right? It's going to get a little ugly, but...
I was going to say, if you haven't already listened to part 1, go and listen to that right now so you're up to date with basically all of the groundwork. And we left off with the building of what would become known as the Murder Castle. And we're about to get into the Columbian World's Fair that's happening in Chicago in the 1890s.
Absolutely. So we were in the middle of construction of the 3rd floor of the castle, right? When we left off?
You were, yes.
Okay. All right. And this, from the outside, the structure was gorgeous. I've seen pictures of it. It looks like a castle. It's beautiful. Out on the ground floor, it has a pharmacy. It also has a jewelry counter. So they're selling really fine goods. It has a restaurant. It has a variety of other retail spaces. Fun fact. So that what was it, Holton? The Holton drugstore that Holmes procured when he first came to Chicago. Well, apparently the owner of that building was trying to spike the rent on him. And so he's actually sold his interest in that particular drugstore to a guy, another druggist, and said, don't worry, there's not going to be any competition. And then he opens up a drugstore across the street, like within 6 months. So you couldn't trust a single thing this guy said. But the building, there was a lot more to it than met the eye. So what are some of the weird things that Holmes installed in his murder castle over the course of the construction?
First of all, a kiln that was installed in the basement, and he told the installer that he was getting into blowing glass and he wanted to make windows and other things, but it was the wrong size. It was actually the size for a crematorium. So it had the smaller window, and it just... I mean, I'm not a glass blower, so I can't say exactly what kind of things we're looking for, but it wasn't the correct size to do what he said he wanted to do.
Well, I mean, think about it. So if you wanted to make big plate glass windows for buildings, you need a huge space. But if you're only trying to burn bodies, you need something that's roughly, the size of a closet, something that's going to hold the body. So that's the difference in size.
People-sized.
Exactly. People size.
All right. Well, he also installs a sketchy soundproof vault, and this is like a whole room that is soundproof.
That's an understatement. Sketchy is an understatement.
Sketchy, yeah. And this is next to his office. Apparently, he has this put in, and he has the vault placed first and then builds around it. So essentially, you can't find it very easily, and once you find it, you can't remove it. And part of the reason he does this was because he knows he's not going to pay for it. So he builds his building around the vault. When they come to repossess this item that he's not paid for, he's like, well, yeah, you can go ahead and try and take the safe, but if you damage the building, I'm going to sue you. In fact, his actual quote, apparently, that he says was, go ahead and take the safe, but I warn you not to damage the building. And he feels pretty smug with himself when they aren't able to repo it and they leave it there.
Side note, there were 2 vaults. So he installed the vault next to his office on the 2nd floor back in like the late 1880s, like 1889, 1890. And then in 1893, at the end of the year, he has a second vault installed on the 3rd floor. And I think that's the one the creditors are coming for, right? It's
the one that he's built around. It's the first one, I think.
It's the first one? Okay. All right.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure it's because he says the building was built around it. So it must have been an earlier...
Yeah, you couldn't. Yeah, if the building was already done and he installs a vault, he can't build the building around it. So, okay.
So, in addition to that, he had weird staircases put in, and I think we mentioned in the last episode that this was like a labyrinth. There's hallways that don't go anywhere, staircases that don't go anywhere, just kind of crazy to essentially disorient people. So disorient people that are coming to repossess things, disorient guests, so he can throw them off, and just make people feel generally weird about being in this building. And one of the staircases I read about was from a second floor bathroom. It was like a hidden hatch to go up to the third floor. So he could literally kind of pop around his building in really weird ways. And in that same vein, he had a lot of hidden rooms, secret passages. And again, this was all to disorient people and hide things. So a lot of the items he was taking on credit, he could hide, and people couldn't find them when they came to repossess them.
There's a really interesting story. His second wife, Myrta Belknap, she came from money, and Holmes, a lot of the money that he used to build this murder castle came from her family. And there's a story that he took Myrta's uncle to the murder castle to give him, it wasn't called the murder castle, but he took him to his castle to show him the construction, and he tried to get him to go up to the roof with him, and he got a really bad feeling. He wouldn't go. Turns out he was actually afraid of heights. But the story is usually told as like, this guy was moments away from being murdered by H.H. Holmes. And he apparently tried to get him to take out a life insurance policy and like protect you. It's just, yeah, just crazy. But, yeah. So anyway, keep going.
Let's see, where was I? Hidden rooms, secret passages. Oh, and the most important aspect, perhaps, for our story today was the alleged trap door to the basement that he built. So this was described as essentially like a garbage chute, a greased garbage chute that was, again, human-sized, and he could take bodies from either the third or second floor and put them into the chute, and they would go all the way down to the basement. Think Sweeney Todd.
Oof. Yikes.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know the first time I came across, like, really looked into this story, like, way before we decided to do this as an episode or even had our podcast, there was a story I read about how he had beds that would tilt backwards into, like, the vats of acid, that's part I don't believe is true, but it's just like a really interesting visual of like you're in bed one night and it tilts backwards and all of a sudden you're in like boiling water or whatever.
Oh my God.
Which is terrifying.
That is the stuff of nightmares.
One of the, myth parts of this, but it wasn't too far gone. I mean, if you're gonna get shoved down a chute in the middle of the night, not great. Not great.
Oh my God.
And then in the basement, there was a whole bunch of like creepy stuff. And this was apparently, it was recorded by newspapers, but it's apparently what the police said that they found.
Yeah.
And there were like torture instruments and vats of acid and dissection tables. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't really know, but it apparently has.
I mean, it adds to the story that this man was like a complete fiend, just killing for sport and then cutting them up. But he probably did have an exam table because his favorite method of getting rid of bodies was to give them to one of his accomplices, essentially, who would boil the flesh from the bones to turn them into full-scale skeletons for medical purposes, for medical offices, for medical schools. So that was his favorite way of getting rid of bodies, and he would pocket like $200 each time. So he actually made money off of killing people. He made money from their skeletons. So not only was he an opportunist, he killed to make sure no one would find out or ruin any of his plans, and he also was benefiting off of the death, too. So there was money coming in from every angle, which is just, I can't even wrap my brain around it. It's insane.
Well, I mean, that's his main goal. It's money, it's opportunity. And if he's going to be a murderer, he might as well make something off of it. He's not doing it for the same reasons that we see other serial killers. And again, more modern serial killers doing it for rage or revenge or whatever the reason might be. He is doing this for money. So if he can't make a profit off of the people that he's murdering, what good is it to him?
So let's talk a little bit about the murders.
Well, before we get into that, who was helping him?
Okay, accomplices. So for number one, and there were probably more, but these are the men that Holmes trusted the most. They had the longest relationships with Holmes while he was in Chicago. So Benjamin Peitzel, Holmes hired him as a carpenter during the early construction of the castle. Peitzel had a big family. He was married to his wife, Carrie, and they had 5 children together. He was also a raging alcoholic, all right? So he was in debt. He was apparently a big, tall, strong guy, but he was drunk like the majority of his life. He acted essentially in the capacity of goon for Holmes and helped him with his schemes. He was a willing participant in the life insurance schemes and that Holmes regularly put on, and this ultimately would lead to Benjamin's own murder. And we'll get into that in just a second. I don't want to give that one away too early. The second accomplice, Charles Chappell, I'm going to call him a man of many trades, but Holmes liked him because he was a, quote, an articulator. And an articulator is someone who could turn corpses into full skeletons for medical offices, classrooms, etc. So he will essentially remove the flesh, boil the bones, and turn them into basically a showpiece. And the last accomplice is Patrick Quinlan. And both Quinlan and Peitzel, I believe, actually lived in the murder castle at one point or another. But Patrick Quinlan was the caretaker who lived inside the building. So when all this stuff comes out about Holmes and the many, many people that he murdered and the terrible schemes happening at the castle, Patrick Quinlan is implicated. Whether he knew or not what was going on, he was there, so people really doubted that he didn't have any idea what was happening. So, and Patrick Quinlan, he actually has a pretty sad story, and after all this is said and done, ends up taking his own life in like the early 1900s, I believe. But yeah, he was really just dragged through the mud when this whole thing hits. But again, people just cannot believe that he had no idea what was going on. Talk about his insurance scams.
His favorite way to get money, basically. And that's because it's big payouts, and to him it's easy because all he has to do is produce a corpse after he's taken out a life insurance policy, and voila, he gets thousands and thousands of dollars. But he was doing this all the time. He would take out insurance policies on random people and families, and that's how he, again, earned a ton of money.
There was a washerwoman who apparently reported to either to the police or to the newspapers after this was all said and done that Holmes approached her and said, "Hey, I'd like for you to take out a $10,000 life insurance policy and I'll give you $6,000 for it." And she was like, "Why would I do that?" He goes, "Because when you die, I'll net $4,000 and you get $6,000 right now for your trouble." And apparently this was extremely terrifying to the woman who was young and healthy at the time. But that's just one of those. I mean, it's really amazing. After all of this comes out, everybody wants to say they were involved in some way or had some sort of brush with death with this guy. And so people, I feel like a lot of people were telling some tall tales who may not have had those types of interactions with Holmes, but there's absolutely no way to disprove it because Holmes himself told 15,000 different stories and different versions and it's just insane. But yeah, there's absolutely no way to confirm what is true and what is not. From the standpoint of like people who came forward later and said, "Oh, I had this weird interaction with Holmes."
Well, except for poor, did you come across the story of Kate Durkee? I think her name was Durkee.
No, tell me.
So Kate Durkee, this poor woman, I guess we could put her under the category of accomplice. She helped with the ownership of some of his buildings. I'm not exactly sure of their relation, but there was some sort of business arrangement that the two had. And Holmes, when he was like rattling off the names of everyone he had killed, added her into his list. And when she read about her supposed murder in the newspaper, she like came forward and was like, "Hi, I'm still alive. Like, he did not kill me. I'm still here. I don't know what you're talking about." So that was a really interesting kind of turn of events of, hey, I didn't actually have any kind of murderous brush with Holmes. I know him, but
I have a theory about why the different versions of the confessions exist, and I'll talk about that when we get to that point. Let's talk first about the Connors.
okay.
In the drugstore on the first floor of Holmes's murder castle, there was a jewelry counter. They sold very fine jewelry, and Holmes hired a jeweler named Ned Connor. I think his full name was Julius Connor, but everyone called him Ned. And Ned brought his wife, Julia, and their, 9-year-old daughter, Pearl. And Julia helped man the jewelry counter, with her husband, Ned. Which, I'm like, Julius and Julia? I mean, what are the chances that you're going to marry someone with a name that similar to your own? I mean, yeah. Anyway, so... I like, this story really breaks my heart because Ned just kind of seemed like a good old boy, just like he's doing his job and he has no idea what's going on. He just eats everything that Holmes is telling him without any type of I guess, suspicion, until he starts to suspect that his wife Julia is sleeping or having some sort of relationship with H.H. Holmes. And so Julia and Ned, they start having some pretty severe marital issues, lots of arguing, and Ned ends up leaving his position. So it's actually, it's Ned. So in the midst of all of this, I mean, this is just like a terrible unraveling of an entire family at the hands of Holmes. But while, Ned suspects Julia and Holmes are having a relationship, that's around the same time that Holmes asks Ned to walk inside that vault in his office to see if it's soundproof. So he walks in there and Holmes closes the door and is like, scream as loud as you can. And apparently no one can hear it, which is very terrifying. And Holmes did let him out. But it was just a really, a blood-chilling moment for Ned. And apparently Ned and Julia decide to split up shortly thereafter. Julia and Pearl continue to live at the castle with Holmes. And shortly thereafter, Julia and Pearl, well, they go missing. According to Holmes, Julia and Pearl left town. And Julia gave him told him she was going to Iowa or something, but told him specifically that she's giving him the wrong location so she can get away from Ned. And Julia and Pearl are never seen again. So what really happened to Julia and Pearl is Holmes killed them both.
So Ned bails. Julia, he's having that affair with her, and shortly after Ned bails, she's like, "I'm pregnant and we need to get married. Like, you need to make this right and make our family like a whole family again." And he agrees to marry her, but only if she'll have an abortion, which super strange. Like, why?
Well, apparently he said that the scandal would ruin him and that they could get married, but she had to get rid of the kid, and thankfully he's a doctor, so he can perform the abortion, and she agrees for some crazy reason. And while he's performing the abortion, she ends up dying. And I guess he said that he tried to perform it appropriately, but he had no idea what he was doing because he had never done that before. And so she ended up dying on the table. And that's why he had to kill Pearl as well, is what he said, I think. One of the versions of what he said.
Yeah. It was, well, that's one version, and then another version is he just didn't want to be bothered with the kid, and he didn't want to watch her and raise her and have her as like a ward. So it was just easier in his eyes to get rid of both of them.
Yeah, I mean, Pearl, can you imagine a 10-year-old daughter would have been a serious complication for him.
But he claimed the same thing with Emmeline. I think it was a very similar story of she was having an abortion performed and she died.
And we're talking about Emmeline Chagrand, Holmes's next victim. He met her actually through Benjamin Peitzel, who had met her at a clinic where she worked as a stenographer. This clinic is a place where Benjamin was taking the cure for alcoholism. And Holmes offered to pay her, I guess, twice the salary that she was making at the clinic to come and do office work for him. He quickly seduced her. They fell in love. He proposed to her. And then all of a sudden, poof, she disappears without a trace. But he frames it as like she ran off with the husband. And like he even had wedding cards printed. He sent letters to her family. Oh, one of the things is like there were letters that were sent. They believe that either he had her write them under duress or locked her in the vault and was like, you have to write these and then I'll let you go. And then he just killed her. Because there was a gas vault or a gas line that led directly into the vault that he had the turn knob to on the outside, which I'm like, there is absolutely no reason why you would need a gas line going inside a secret soundproof vault unless you were trying to kill some people, right? Is there any reason for that? I can't think of any practical reason.
He probably had it installed because that would have been the lighting source. So he probably said it was for a light.
That's a good idea.
When he was putting it in.
But no one knows for sure because he would hire and fire people so frequently that no one could understand what the purpose of the building was.
No.
All right. And finally, Minnie and Anne, a.k.a. Nanny Williams. And I think Minnie is the one that breaks my heart because, I mean... So Minnie and Annie were orphaned, and they had like a pretty wealthy benefactor, a pretty wealthy like guardian, and they had come into some land in Texas, like $10,000 worth of property. And Minnie was like not particularly attractive. She was kind of older and not necessarily older, but I think Minnie was like pretty easy pickings for someone like Holmes, who's like this gorgeous, suave, supposedly very successful doctor, and Minnie just falls head over heels. And Holmes apparently, promised to marry her. They have like this little ceremony. He's like, oh, we can't invite any family or friends just because whatever bullshit reason he gave. He never registered the marriage with the state, I don't think, but I think it's alleged that he like had a ceremony performed with her. And then it was like, hey, your sister Nanny Anne should come and visit. And I think according to the Eric Larson book, he killed Anne in the vault with the gas and then went and picked up Minnie and said Anne was waiting for them back at the castle. And that's where he killed Minnie as well. Minnie signed over like her land rights to her $10,000 property in Fort Worth, Texas. And it's just really sad. Like the letters that Anne was writing in the days before her death, she was just very optimistic and excited that Holmes said he was going to take them, to Europe and was going to show them, the world, that Minnie had done very well for herself. And it's just really tragic because none of it was real. None of it was true. It was all like before this even started, Holmes knew what he was probably. I think Holmes knew what he was going to do before Minnie even came to Chicago. Okay, but finally, I think like the biggest one and the one that leads to his death is the murder of Benjamin Peitzel and 3 of Benjamin Peitzel's children. So why don't you dig into that one?
Yeah, so before we get into Peitzel, we have to talk about like what's happened to lead up to this. And that is the fire that happens on the 3rd floor of the murder castle.
Right, yeah, the fire happens about halfway through 1893, about June, July, right after Minnie and Annie disappear. The 3rd floor of Holmes's murder castle goes up in flames.
And he might have started that himself, probably started it himself as an insurance scam.
The insurance company launched an investigation into the 3rd floor fire. And at the time, the name on the deed to the building was one of Holmes's aliases. And the insurance investigator, because he couldn't figure out, like he couldn't find any definitive proof that this was arson, they were like, okay, yeah, sure, we'll pay out the claim, but only if the insert alias's name shows up and claims it in person. And the insurance investigator knew Holmes's face. He knew him in the flesh. So there was absolutely no way that Holmes himself was going to be able to masquerade as this alias. And guess what? That the alias never showed up to pick up the money. So, I mean, I think that pretty much proves that this was another scam from Holmes. But in the process of this insurance investigation, it's like punching a hornet's nest of creditors that are coming after Holmes. And apparently Holmes shows up at a lawyer's office, and there are like dozens of his creditors all packed into this office, holding pitchforks, ready to burn him at the stake. And apparently Holmes gives this emotional treatise of like, I'm so sorry. Like, I've fallen on hard times. Like, all I want to do is pay my creditors. That's all I want to do. And like, he gets to the lawyer. The lawyer's like, oh, well, maybe we should see, if we can work something out versus just arresting this fraud. And they actually tell Holmes to go sit out in the office and wait so all the dozens of creditors can discuss what the next move is. And at some point, Holmes just fucking bails, right? He leaves. He of course he does. He knows he's not leaving that office without getting arrested. So he flees. And this is like January 1st, 1894. He leaves. And guess what? He goes to Texas because he now has, land claims that belong to Minnie Williams. But while he's in Texas, he decides he's going to be a cowboy and steals 2 horses. Okay, so let's think of the worst place in the United States that you could steal a horse. It's Texas. You don't steal a horse in Texas. I don't care who you are. You just don't do it. So Holmes obviously has to leave, but there's a warrant put out for his arrest, and that's going to lead to his downfall. But this is just the beginning, right? So what happens over the course of 1894?
So he goes to multiple different places, including St. Louis, where he purchases yet another drugstore, and spends some time in prison there. What was the imprisonment related to? Was it another scam? I can't remember.
I think it was something related to an insurance scam. And so he was put in prison for...
It's like 3 days.
It was like 3 days. While he was in jail, he had a cellmate who was actually a famous Western train robber named Marion Hedgepeth. And, sorry, take it away.
Yeah. Well, he told his cellmate, yeah, that's the right term, about his life insurance scam. And the latest scam that he had cooked up was to fake the death of his partner. And this is where we get back to Benjamin Peitzel. He offered the man $500 if he would help him secure a lawyer so he could get out of prison and make this scheme happen. And, well, Hedgepeth did that. But as Holmes is known for by this point, he did not pay up. And in retaliation, Hedgepeth told the authorities about the life insurance scam. And this is really what's going to lead to his conviction, not capture. It was just a conviction, right? He tells him afterwards.
Yeah, but Hedgepeth had basically told the authority. I don't know who he talked to. It was either the investigator for the Fidelity Mutual Life Association who had written the policy for Benjamin Peitzel. But either way, they arrested him in Boston, and so he had the warrant for defrauding the life insurance company, but there was also that warrant from Texas for stealing the horses. So what he did, because he didn't want to go back to Texas, because he knew that it was going to be bad news if he went back to Texas, he confessed to the life insurance scam about Benjamin Peitzel. And then the authorities figure out that they didn't actually fake Peitzel's death, that was Peitzel himself. And so as a result, they end up charging him with Peitzel's murder.
Well, and I think he thought he'd get away with it because they didn't call Peitzel Peitzel. They put it under a different name, an alias.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, or were they supposed to put it under an alias and then they didn't?
I think they just took it out on Peitzel. I think
okay, that's what it was. The original plan was to make up another person and do it that way. And Peitzel's like, no, just put it under me. And I don't know why he offered to do that because he knows what Holmes, by that point, you've got to know what Holmes is like. So anyway, They took the insurance policy out on Peitzel. They go forward with their plan. They do this in Philadelphia, though. So he's left St. Louis now, obviously skipping bail, gone to Philadelphia. They've taken out this life insurance policy. Everything is going as it should. And what they had planned to do was find a cadaver or a body or a person as a stand in for Peitzel and fake a lab explosion and split the money. What happens instead is that Holmes kills Peitzel with a chloroform overdose and still tries to like fake the lab explosion, make it look like an accident. And although it's sketchy, the insurance pays out, but to Peitzel's widow, Carrie. And Holmes manages to convince her that there's a bunch of money still owed on the building and will get over $7,000 of that $10,000 life insurance policy from her.
According to Holmes's confession, so he writes a confession for the Philadelphia Inquirer, but according to that confession, which is widely discredited, like there's, I mean, what, 6 people that he named as killing, as that he killed were alive, but he said that he found Peitzel at the rental home in a drunken stupor, and he doused him in kerosene and lit him on fire and burned Peitzel alive. And when Peitzel was dead, he poured like 1.5 ounces of chloroform down his throat and attempted to like burn his stomach or something. I don't know. It was like an attempt to make it look like there was some sort of explosion caused by a mixture of cleaning chemicals. I don't think that was planned. I don't think he actually planned to kill Peitzel. I think Peitzel became a liability because his drinking got completely out of control. I mean, he was a drunk for the entire time, the entire 7 years that Holmes knew him. And I think that it got bad. I think it got really bad, and he became a liability and maybe threatened Holmes or did something, because to me, that's the only reason that they would have actually gone through with this, because Peitzel was Holmes's goon. Like,
Yeah.
why would you, unless you were like, all right, I'm going to Europe. This is it. I'm getting rid of all my accomplices. I'm leaving. Here we go. I mean, I don't know. It just looks really weird, but.
It does, but he was also trying to make his way to Canada. So maybe he was like, let's just get rid of all these loose
Maybe.
ends and start fresh in Canada.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I really don't know what was going through his mind or if it was planned or not. I mean, they definitely had planned this scheme, and it would have been convenient if he felt like he had to get rid of Peitzel to just actually kill Peitzel and claim the money, because it was already set up. It just, to me, it feels like really weird that rather than use a fake name like they always had done, that they finally put him in.
Well, I mean, Holmes in his confession said that Peitzel was going to kill himself. And that was like the thing. Like, Peitzel wanted to kill himself. And that's actually what he wrote. Holmes, in prison, Holmes wrote a letter to Carrie Peitzel and said that like he kept trying to kill himself. Everywhere we went, he just kept trying to kill himself. Like, what the fuck? Anyway, but okay, so he kills Peitzel. They collect on the money. And then Holmes embarks on this Midwestern caravan trip with 3 groups simultaneously, okay? And these groups include, number 1, his brand new wife. At the beginning of 1884, Holmes married Georgiana Yoke. He married her in Denver, Colorado. And so he is traveling with Georgiana Yoke in one group. In the next group, he is traveling with Carrie Peitzel and one of her daughters. And then in the third group, Holmes is traveling with 3 of Carrie and Benjamin Peitzel's children. And that is Alice, Nellie, and Howard. Okay? So this is all very confusing, but they go to like 7 different cities, okay? And none of them knows that none of these specific groups know that Holmes is traveling. Like, they're all like within 10 minutes of each other at any given time, okay? So Carrie is within 10 minutes of her 3 other children, and Holmes just takes them on this tour of the Midwest. They go to Cincinnati, they go to Indianapolis, Indiana, they go to Toronto, Canada, and over the course of this trip, all 3 of the children, the Peitzel children, Nellie, Alice, and Howard, well, they disappear. They disappear completely. They end up, the two remaining groups, so the group he's traveling with, Carrie and her daughter, and then Georgiana Yoke, they all end up in Boston, which is where Holmes is arrested. What happens then?
So, he's arrested because of that warrant on the horse theft. So he gets caught on that, plus with the old cellmate like telling authorities about his scam doesn't really help him. So he's held on the warrant for horse theft as far as I can tell, because they can't substantiate the life insurance scam yet. But like you said, while he's being held, he'll confess to the life insurance scam to avoid being sent back to Texas, because he's more afraid of facing anything in Texas than he is of facing literal murder in Boston or Philadelphia.
I can't blame him. Hell no. If you're going to commit crime, don't do it in Texas. Anywhere else other than Texas, because Texas, they handle their shit, man.
Yeah. And I think God. His ego's got a lot to do with this of, I can talk myself out of a life insurance scam. I've done it so many times, but you can't talk yourself out of horse theft in Texas. So no getting around that. So he's extradited to Philadelphia, where this murder happened. And the whole time Holmes is like, yeah, Peitzel's alive. Like, it was fake. That was a cadaver. We pulled off our original plan. And he really thinks he'll get away with this.
The district attorney in Philadelphia, while they're dealing with this debacle and trying to figure out if Benjamin Peitzel is alive or dead, Carrie Peitzel is actually imprisoned. Did you know that? Carrie Peitzel was in jail for like 6 months because they thought that she was in on the insurance scam. And eventually she's released, I think, when they figure out she had nothing to do with it. The district attorney calls in a detective named Frank Geyer. And this is a Philadelphia detective who is almost has superhuman investigative skills, okay? The fact that he is able to accomplish in 1895, I'm really, really impressed, okay? So I really love this guy, Frank Geyer. So he's charged with finding the 3 missing children, the 3 missing Peitzel children. Alice, Nellie, and Howard, okay? But think about it. We just said Holmes had traveled with these 3 groups simultaneously through like 5 different cities. And by the by, he is checking them in and out of hotels in the same city, is using a variety of different aliases. So it is extremely difficult to track these people down. But what Frank Geyer does, first he goes to Cincinnati and he takes pictures of Holmes and pictures of the children. And he literally canvasses every hotel in Cincinnati, Indianapolis, and Toronto. Like, he is going from hotel to hotel, showing these pictures, checking logbooks. I mean, this is the most exhaustive search that I have ever read about, okay? I mean, by one man. And every time he goes to a new city, he's hooked up with, a local detective to help him who knows the lay of the land. What they find when they go to Toronto is that Holmes had rented I believe he rented a house and according to the landlady, had bought a spade and asked if it was okay for him to dig in the cellar to store potatoes, and then disappeared. He was never seen again. And so Frank Geyer goes, that's suspicious. So he goes into the cellar and finds a bit of earth that is like just recently tamped down. And that's where they find the bodies of Alice and Nellie. Very tragic. I think Alice was 15 and Nellie was like 11 or 12. But there's still the issue of little Howard. Now, apparently Howard was like the least favorite kid Holmes dealt with. And they stop in the logbooks. The logbooks stop like referencing the little boy. The hotel logbooks stop referencing the little boy in Indianapolis. So Frank Geyer believes that Howard is somewhere in Indianapolis. And they find a house that Holmes had rented under an alias. And Holmes apparently had been traveling with a big stove. Like, he had bought a stove and installed this stove at a... It's really weird. Like I think the owner of the house was like, it was so strange. He had no furniture and just a kid and a stove, and then he disappeared. It was like, whatever. Well, inside the stove, they find a hunk of matter that ends up being organs that had been stuffed so tightly in the chute of the stove that it hadn't burned the interior of this hunk. So it was like charred on the outside. On the inside was like liver, kidneys, heart kind of thing. So that was Howard. So Holmes had murdered all 3 children, but this entire time he's maintaining that everyone's still alive. But once this news hits that Frank Geyer has discovered the remains of the 3 children, 3 Peitzel children, it hits the papers. And at that point, I think Holmes pretty much knows the jig is up. Even though he knows the jig is up, he doesn't take responsibility for this. He wrote a full, like, a couple hundred pages of a memoir while in prison. And essentially just says, like, none of this is me. Everybody, you know, they're framing me, or they're not asking the right questions. He publishes this right after the discovery of Alice Nelling and Howard Peitzel's bodies, and he's trying to sway public opinion.
Well, and that's because as soon as these stories hit the newspapers, like everywhere he has been and people have known like H.H. Holmes or one of his aliases, they start searching those properties. And I mean, the big one is, of course, the murder castle, as it will become known. And that's what gets so sensationalized, of like how many bodies went through there, especially with the World's Fair happening. And I mean, this is a national story because he went to so many different places.
Yeah. And so it's right after the discovery of these bodies that they bust into the murder castle, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they swarm it. They have to try and figure out like the lay of it and where everything is. And of course, the basement is where they discover like bone pieces, and I think they found like watch chains and all sorts of random things in the kiln that was for windows, not for humans.
Yeah, they found things that belonged to the Williams sisters. They found things that belonged to Julia and Pearl.
Yeah, then they found like all sorts of like remains of wallets and, you know, bits and pieces that he had stolen off of his supposed customers. And I think all in all, the police report that they find evidence of 15 bodies, whether it was pieces of bones or remnants of whatever they found in the kiln. They put together that it was 15 at least. And they don't know, of course, the true extent. So that puts Chicago into a rage. It puts, you know, all of these different cities that he had been to in kind of like a fear, because it was happening right under their noses. No one ever knew. I mean, they knew he was a scamster, but they didn't know how sinister he really could be.
They don't find enough to convict Holmes in Chicago, right?
Yeah, there wasn't enough, like, and this part always really gets to me because they found evidence of like people being murdered in the basement.
Well, it's because in 1895, somebody burned the castle down. They burned the whole thing down, and it burned all possible evidence.
One way or another, like, they couldn't link enough to Holmes to try and have a trial in Chicago about this. The only thing that they really had any concrete evidence for and that they could have enough to know that they were going to get a conviction was on the murder of Ben Peitzel and the insurance scam.
The authorities, I mean, they had a plan. They were going to get Holmes. So, you know, the Philadelphia DA, they're going to they put him on trial for the murder of Ben Peitzel. But Indianapolis also had indicted Holmes on the murders of Alice and Nellie, and Toronto indicted him on the murder of Howard. So if the Philadelphia case failed, well, then Indianapolis would try him. And then Toronto would try him if that failed as well. The entire point of this was they wanted him to get the death penalty. And if he didn't, they were going to try him until he got the death penalty. So I read this whole collection, and let me find who did it. But this collection of Holmes's documents, essentially his autobiography, the confession that he wrote for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and then the letter that he wrote to Carrie Peitzel are all included in this collection. And it is called Holmes, a Serial Killer in His Own Words, by Herman Webster Mudgett, better known as H.H. Holmes. And this was a collection put together by a guy named Matt Lake. Holmes is paid by the Philadelphia Inquirer somewhere in the ballpark of about $7,000 for a full confession. Let's journey back just for a second. When Holmes published his autobiography, his memoir, right after the Peitzel children were found dead, he denied everything. He said he blamed everyone else. He blamed Minnie Williams. He blamed a mysterious fictitious man named Hatch. He blamed anyone and everyone he could for these crimes and was like, I'm just an innocent bystander who's just a do-gooder, who's a very successful businessman, yada, yada, yada. Well, a few months later, the Philadelphia Inquirer publishes this hand-penned confession in which Holmes reverses everything he said and instead confesses to 27 murders. And how this goes is he just goes, the first person, Julia Connor, the second, Pearl, and then like literally just goes down the list for 27 entries and talks about, all the people that he killed. And this is sensational, right? I mean, no one in the United States at this point, this is a time where you took men at their word, right? Which is why Holmes was able to dupe everyone, because no one suspected that there were people like this. It's
like a more sinister version of the invention of lying.
Seriously. I mean, you're not kidding. It is that. That is the best description that I've heard. Everyone just took him at his word, or they didn't ask questions, or they're like, that's fucking weird, but I guess I'm just going to go about my day. So when Holmes confesses, I mean, the jig is up. I really want to know where that money went. I want to know what he did with the $7,000.
Right.
Because he is hanged May 7th, 1896, and his last words, and I'm going to read them to you. These are his last words. Gentlemen, he said, I have a very few words to say. In fact, I would make no statement at this time except that by not speaking, I would appear to acquiesce in life in my execution. I only want to say that the extent of my wrongdoings in taking human life consisted in the deaths of 2 women, they having died at my hands as the result of criminal operations. I wish to also state, however, so that there will be no misunderstanding hereafter, I am not guilty of taking the life of any of the Peitzel family, the 3 children or the father, of whose death I am convicted and for which I am today to be hanged. That is all. So that's what he said on the gallows, as they're putting the noose around his neck. That's what he says. And I honestly think that the reason he published all these different... First of all, he did the Philadelphia Inquirer confession for the money. But I also think he published all these different confessions because he wanted to introduce reasonable doubt or an insanity defense. I mean, if you can't trust anything the guy says, maybe it's like, well, maybe he's just crazy. I think that's what he was trying to do, but I don't think anyone was buying it at that point. You find the remains of 3 children under the age of 15... You're fucked, like you're done.
As you should be. So, yeah, they did not believe him. I wonder if any of his wives got the money. I doubt it, but
I mean,
I don't know where it would have gone.
Georgiana Yoke. I mean, I don't know. Maybe. I honestly feel like, so, there was like a big conspiracy theory that he was able to get out of that he wasn't actually hanged, that he was able to kind of swindle his way out. I mean, I think it would be interesting if he did the Philadelphia Inquirer confession to get that money to pay his guards to let him out.
Yeah, that could have been it. But they dug him up.
They dug him up. So talk about that.
Well, one of his last wishes was to be buried under 10 feet of concrete, which might sound like a surprise, but was pretty common because of all of the grave robbers that we talked about in part 1. Holmes himself probably included in that list, so he was well acquainted with what it was like to dig up a body and how you couldn't get to one. So he requested to be buried under concrete so no one could get to him. And when they tried to dispel this rumor that he wasn't actually hanged and he had gotten away, they could see that it was him because he was so well preserved under this 10 foot of concrete.
Okay, that's it. We did it. That is the end of our 2-part series on H.H. Holmes. We hope you've enjoyed this. If you liked what you heard today, I want you to head to your favorite podcast platform and leave us a 5-star review. If you want to tell us a little bit about what you thought of today's episode, head to our website, thegoodoldayspod.com, and go to the contact tab and drop us an email. Send us a message. We do have a new email address. It is mail@thegoodoldayspod.com, so you can reach out to us via email. You can also reach out to us via social. And Jasmin, what's that information?
So our socials are Facebook and Instagram at the Good Old Days Pod and Twitter at the Good OD Pod. We're on TikTok, as I said last time. Hopefully by the time this episode premieres, we're still okay. If TikTok is still around, it is the Good Old Days Pod as well. And you can search for us on all of those platforms by just typing in the Good Old Days Podcast and we'll come up. You'll spot our very noticeable logo and follow us for all the stuff that we're working on, to send us suggestions of future episodes. And we have a few things that we're going to be asking your opinion on as we go through this season. So definitely come and join us.
Yeah. And merchandise. We are working on putting together a merchandise store. I mean, we're about ready to launch it, I think, in the next couple weeks. But at some point, we're going to have a design contest, or at least a design vote, to figure out what you would like to see on a variety of different products, if that's something y'all are interested in. So just another thing we're working on at the Good Old Days Pod. And thank y'all so much. We love you guys. Thank you for listening. If you've made it this far, you are you're our hardcore fan base. So thank you so much. We appreciate you. Keep coming back for more. We are working hard to bring you the best possible content. So thank y'all so much. Enjoy your week. Goodbye.